The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Eleanor Ashworth felt her stomach drop before the auctioneer even spoke the word sold. She knew that voice. She knew that pause before it. She turned her head, and there he was again, standing 3 rows behind her, with his arms folded, and the faintest curve of satisfaction on his mouth. The Duke of Rensworth had won, again. This was the 4th time in as many weeks that Gareth Ashford, Duke of Rensworth, had outbid her on a piece she had spent days researching, weeks planning for, and every spare coin preparing to win. This time it was a small oil painting of a harbor at dusk, unsigned, but with brushwork that Eleanor was almost certain belonged to a minor Dutch master whose works had recently begun fetching triple their old prices in London's quieter auction rooms. She had planned to buy it for £18 and sell it within the month for enough to cover her father's tailor bill and put something aside besides. Now it belonged to a duke who did not need the money, and probably did not even know what he had just purchased. Eleanor rose from her seat, smoothed the front of her gray wool dress, and walked directly toward him, before her nerve could fail her. The auction room was still busy with the low hum of departing bidders, porters lifting furniture, and the auctioneer calling the next lot, but she did not care who heard her. "You did not even look at the brushwork," she said, stopping in front of him. "You do not know what you just bought." The Duke tilted his head, unbothered by her tone, which only made her more irritated. "I bought a painting I liked, Miss Ashworth. Is that not permitted at an auction?" "You liked it because I wanted it," she said. "You have followed me to every sale this season. The furniture auction on Great Portland Street, the estate sale in Richmond, now here. It cannot be coincidence." A small line appeared between his brows, as though he were considering whether to be amused or offended. "Perhaps, Miss Ashworth, we simply have similar taste. Or perhaps," she said, "you enjoy watching me lose." For a moment he said nothing, and something flickered across his face that she could not read. Something that was not quite mockery, and not quite apology either. Then the moment passed, and the familiar coolness returned to his eyes, the same distant politeness that made most of London believe the Duke of Rensworth was made of marble rather than blood. "If it troubles you so greatly," he said, "I will have the painting delivered to your home. You may study the brushwork at your leisure. I only ask that you tell me what you discover." The offer startled her, but she would not let him see it. "I do not need your charity, Your Grace. It is not charity, it is curiosity. I confess I do not know the difference between a Dutch master and a house painter, and you clearly do. Consider it payment for the education." Before she could answer, he gave her a short bow, turned, and walked toward the door, leaving her standing there with her fists clenched at her sides, and her pulse doing something strange and unwelcome in her throat. Eleanor had grown used to being underestimated. She was 23, unmarried by choice rather than misfortune, and known in certain circles as the woman who could spot a forged signature at 20 paces and talk down a greedy dealer without raising her voice. Her father, Edmund Ashworth, had once been a moderately prosperous gentleman, with a comfortable house on the edge of Mayfair, and enough income from his small estate in Kent to keep them both in modest comfort. But in the last 2 years, that comfort had eroded, slowly at first, and then all at once. And Eleanor had taken it upon herself to mend what she could, through her knowledge of art, porcelain, and rare books. She did not tell her father the full extent of what she did. He believed she attended these sales out of interest, a harmless hobby for an unmarried daughter with too much time and too sharp a mind. He did not know that the money from her small, careful resales had quietly paid 2 of his debts already, nor that she kept a ledger hidden beneath the false bottom of her writing desk, tracking every pound she earned and every pound still owed. She walked home from the auction house that afternoon, with her chin high and her thoughts churning. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of coal smoke and wet leaves, and she barely noticed the carriages rattling past, or the shopkeepers calling out their wares. She was too busy replaying the conversation with the Duke, turning his words over, as though they were a puzzle she could not quite solve. Why would a man with no need of money, and no evident interest in art, bother to outbid her, week after week, on pieces that meant nothing to him, and everything to her? She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she would simply have to be faster, sharper, more decisive at the next sale. She told herself a great many things on that walk home, and none of them made her feel any better. When she reached the house, she found her father in his study, though the door was only half open, and the curtains were drawn against the afternoon light, which struck her as strange. since he usually liked to read by the window. She pushed the door open a little further, and found him sitting behind his desk with a letter in his hands, his face gray, in a way she had never seen before. "Father," she said, "is something wrong?" He looked up at her, and for a moment, he seemed almost like a stranger, an older, smaller version of the man she knew, his shoulders bent forward, as though something heavy had been placed upon them. Then he folded the letter quickly and set it beneath a stack of other papers, and the familiar mask of calm settled back over his features. "Nothing at all, my dear," he said. "Merely business. You know how tiresome business can be." Eleanor did not believe him, but she had learned over the years that pressing her father, when he wished to hide something, rarely produced results. Instead, she crossed the room and kissed his forehead, the way she had done since she was a girl, and asked whether he wished for tea. "That would be lovely," he said, and his smile, though warm, did not quite reach his eyes. She left the room with her mind uneasy, and later that evening, after the household had quieted and the last of the servants had gone to bed, she crept back down the stairs in her dressing gown with a single candle to light her way. She told herself she was not spying. She told herself she only wished to know that her father was well. But when she reached the study and found the door unlocked, she did not hesitate to slip inside and search the desk for the letter he had hidden. It took her only a moment to find it, tucked beneath a ledger of household accounts. She unfolded it with trembling hands, and as she read the words within, the candle seemed to grow colder in her grip, though the flame did not waver. The letter was from a solicitor's office, informing Mr. Edmund Ashworth that the note of hand he had signed some months prior, in the amount of £4,000, had been purchased from his original creditor by another party. The letter did not name the new holder of the debt outright, but it stated plainly that all future correspondence regarding repayment should be directed to the office of His Grace, the Duke of Rensworth. Eleanor read the sentence 3 times before the meaning fully settled into her mind. She sat down slowly in her father's chair, the candle flickering shadows across the walls, and for a long moment she could not think at all. £4,000. Her father, who had always seemed careful, if not wealthy, had somehow accumulated a debt of £4,000, and the man who now held that debt, who now held her father's fortune and future in his hands, was the very same man who had spent the last month outbidding her at every auction she attended. It was not coincidence. She understood that now with a clarity that made her feel slightly ill. He had known who she was from the very first sale. He had known about her father's troubles, perhaps long before she herself had learned of them. And he had been watching her, testing her, perhaps even enjoying some private amusement at her expense, while she scrambled to earn pennies through paintings and porcelain, unaware that the true danger to her family's future was standing quietly behind her, with a paddle raised at every sale. She did not sleep that night. She sat by her window until the sky turned pale gray with the first hints of dawn, turning the letter over and over in her mind, searching for some explanation that did not end in humiliation or ruin. Perhaps it was truly a coincidence, she told herself, though she did not believe it. Perhaps the Duke did not even know the details of the debt he had purchased, and some clerk in his employ had simply seen an opportunity for profit. But even as she tried to convince herself, she remembered the look on his face at the auction house, that flicker of something unreadable when she had accused him of enjoying her losses, and she began to suspect that he had known exactly what he was doing all along. By morning, she had made a decision. She would not wait for her father to confess, nor would she wait for some solicitor's letter to explain what had already happened. She would go to Rensworth House herself, and she would demand to know precisely what the Duke intended to do with the fate of her family resting so casually in his hands. She dressed carefully, choosing her sturdiest walking boots and her plainest bonnet, the sort of clothing that said she had come on business and not for social pleasantries. She told her father she was going to visit her friend Charlotte Vane, which was not entirely a lie, since she did intend to call on Charlotte eventually, though not before she had settled the matter that truly occupied her thoughts. The walk to Rensworth House took the better part of an hour, and by the time she arrived at the tall iron gates with their carved crest of a wolf beneath a crown, her nerve had hardened into something close to anger. She did not wait to be announced properly. She informed the startled footman that she was Miss Eleanor Ashworth, and that she required to speak with His Grace on a matter of urgent business, and something in her tone must have convinced him that refusal would only cause a scene. for he showed her into a small drawing room and disappeared to fetch his master. She did not have long to wait. Within a few minutes, the door opened, and the Duke of Rensworth entered, still in his morning coat, his dark hair slightly disordered, as though he had been interrupted at his desk. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, faintly surprised. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "this is an unexpected pleasure." "I doubt very much that you find it a pleasure, Your Grace," she said, and she withdrew the folded letter from her reticule and held it out to him. "Perhaps you can explain to me why my father's debt of £4,000 now belongs to you." His expression shifted, the surprise fading into something more careful, more guarded, though he did not look away from her gaze. He stepped forward and took the letter, though he did not open it, as though he already knew its contents by heart. "Sit down, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly. "I think we have a great deal to discuss." She did not sit. She stood exactly where she was, her arms folded, her chin lifted, refusing to be softened by the sudden gentleness in his voice. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me now, and do not trouble yourself with courtesy, for I find I have very little patience left for it this morning." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something in his eyes seemed almost like respect, though she was too angry to notice it clearly. Then he set the letter down upon a small table between them, and folded his hands behind his back, and began, at last, to speak. "Your father came to me some months ago," he said, "through an intermediary, seeking a private loan to settle certain gambling debts he had accumulated at cards. He did not wish the matter to become public, for obvious reasons, and so the loan was arranged quietly, through channels that concealed my involvement even from him. I did not seek this debt out of malice, Miss Ashworth, nor did I purchase it with any wicked design. I purchased it because the original creditor intended to sell it to a far less patient man, one who would have seen your father in debtor's prison within the month, rather than allow him time to repay." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Gambling debts," she repeated. "My father does not gamble." "Your father," said the Duke gently, "has been gambling for some time, though I suspect he has hidden it well, even from you." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he was mistaken, that her father was a careful and steady man who would never risk their small remaining fortune at a card table. But even as the denial rose in her throat, she thought of the gray look on his face the previous evening, the letter hidden beneath his ledgers, the strange evasiveness that had crept into his manner these last months, and she found she could not speak the words with any real conviction. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" she asked instead, her voice quieter now. "Why let me discover it from a letter never meant for my eyes?" "Because it was not my place," he said. "And because, if I am honest, Miss Ashworth, I did not know quite how to approach you. I did not wish you to think I meant to use your father's misfortune against you, though I see now that hiding the truth has achieved precisely that effect regardless." Eleanor turned away from him, walking toward the window, where the pale autumn light fell across the gravel drive and the neat rows of clipped hedges beyond. She thought of every auction, every triumphant smile he had worn as he outbid her, every time she had accused him of enjoying her defeat, and she felt her cheeks grow hot with the memory. "You watched me at those sales," she said without turning around. "You knew about the debt even then. Did you find it amusing to see me scrape together shillings while you held my father's fortune in your pocket?" "I never found it amusing," he said, and something in his voice made her turn back to look at him. "I found it remarkable. I have never met a woman who could identify a forged signature across a crowded room, nor one who bargained so fiercely for pieces she believed in. I confess I began attending those sales as much to see you succeed as to see you fail, though I understand now how poorly that must have looked from where you stood." She did not know how to answer that, and for a long moment, the two of them simply looked at each other across the quiet room, the fire crackling softly in the grate, the weight of everything unsaid pressing against the silence. Then Eleanor straightened her shoulders, reminding herself why she had come. "What do you intend to do?" she asked. "With the debt?" "I have not yet decided," he admitted. "I had thought, perhaps, to allow your father more time than the original arrangement provided, but I confess your arrival this morning has given me another notion, one I had not fully considered until this moment." "And what notion is that, Your Grace?" He studied her for a long moment, as though weighing whether to speak the thought aloud, and when he finally did, his voice carried a note of something almost like hope, though she would not recognize it as such until much later. "Perhaps," he said, We might come to an arrangement that serves us both. Eleanor felt a chill of suspicion settle over her. Though beneath it, quiet and unwelcome, she also felt the faint stirring of curiosity. The same curiosity that had drawn her to every auction room in London, in search of value hidden beneath a plain surface. She did not yet know what the Duke intended, but she understood. Standing there in his drawing room, with her father's fate resting so precariously in the balance, that whatever came next would change the course of her life entirely, whether she wished it to or not. "Tell me your arrangement," she said, and she folded her hands to keep them from shaking, and waited to hear what price a duke might ask of a woman who had nothing left to bargain with but her wit and her pride. He did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the fireplace and stood with one hand resting on the mantel, staring into the flames as though gathering his thoughts before he dared to speak them aloud. Eleanor watched him, her arms still folded, her pulse beating fast despite her efforts to appear composed. Whatever he was about to propose, she suspected it would not be simple, and she had learned enough of dukes and their schemes over the past weeks to be wary of anything offered so carefully. "I have no wish to ruin your father," he said at last. "Nor do I have any wish to see you humiliated by circumstances that were never of your making, but I will not pretend the debt does not exist, nor that I have no right to see it repaid in some fashion. What I propose is this. I am in the process of furnishing my late uncle's estate in Hertfordshire, a house that has stood largely untouched for a decade and is filled with items of uncertain value, some genuine treasures, others likely worthless trifles that generations of my family mistook for treasures. I require someone with a discerning eye to help me sort truth from fiction among those collections, someone who understands paintings, porcelain, and old books well enough to know what deserves to remain and what ought to be sold. In exchange for your services as my consultant in this matter, I will extend the terms of your father's repayment considerably, and I will ensure that no further pressure is placed upon him while the arrangement continues." Eleanor stared at him, trying to determine whether this was mockery dressed as kindness or something else entirely. "You wish to employ me," she said slowly, "as though I were a dealer you might hire from a shop on Bond Street." "Not employ, precisely," he said. "I would not insult you by offering wages as though you were a servant. Consider it a partnership. You would advise me on what to keep and what to sell, and any profit from the sales would be divided fairly between us, with your portion applied directly against your father's debt. It would allow you to work openly at what you already do so well in secret, without the indignity of scraping shillings together at public auctions, while pretending it is merely a pastime." The words struck closer to the truth than she liked, and she felt her cheeks warm again, though this time from something closer to indignation than embarrassment. "How do you know so much of what I do in secret, Your Grace?" "I make it my business to know a great many things," he said, though there was no cruelty in his tone, only a quiet honesty that unsettled her more than any boast could have done. "I know, for instance, that you have already settled 2 of your father's smaller debts through your own efforts. Though he believes you spend your afternoons merely admiring paintings for pleasure, I know you have a talent that most men in my position would either dismiss or exploit, and I find myself unwilling to do either." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, turning his offer over in her mind, as carefully as she might examine a painting for signs of forgery. She did not trust him, not entirely, not yet. But she understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality that had guided her through every difficult negotiation at every auction house in London, that his offer was, in fact, generous, perhaps even more generous than she had any right to expect from a man who held her family's fate so completely in his hands. "And if I refuse," she asked, "what then?" "Then I shall extend your father a reasonable period to repay the debt as originally arranged," he said. "I will not threaten you, Miss Ashworth, nor will I punish your family for your refusal, but I confess I would consider it a wasted opportunity, for both of us." She studied his face, searching for some sign of deception, some hint that this arrangement concealed a darker purpose she had not yet uncovered. But she found only the same steady, guarded expression she had come to associate with him these past weeks, the expression of a man who kept his true feelings locked away, as carefully as she kept her hidden ledger beneath the false bottom of her desk. "I will need to think on it," she said finally. "Of course," he said, and something in his voice suggested he had expected nothing less from her. "Take whatever time you require. But I will say this, Miss Ashworth, before you go. Whatever you decide, I hope you will not let pride alone guide your answer. Pride is a fine thing to possess, but it makes for poor company when the fire has burned low and the debts remain unpaid. She left Rensworth House with her thoughts in greater disorder than when she had arrived, and she did not go to visit Charlotte Vane, as she had told her father, but instead walked the long way home, through the quieter streets, turning the Duke's proposal over and over in her mind. By the time she reached her own front door, she had very nearly decided to refuse him outright, to find some other way to manage her father's debt, without placing herself under obligation, to a man who had, until only yesterday, been nothing more to her than a rival at auction. But that evening, over a quiet supper of thin soup and bread that had grown a little too familiar in recent months, she watched her father across the table, saw the tiredness in his eyes and the tremor in his hands as he lifted his spoon, and she understood that pride, however comforting, would not pay £4,000, nor would it spare her father the shame of debtor's court should some less patient man come to hold his note instead. She did not sleep well that night either, though her thoughts had shifted from anger to calculation, weighing the risks of the Duke's proposal against the certain danger of refusing it. She thought of the harbor painting he had promised to send her, of the strange kindness in his voice when he spoke of her talent, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether she had misjudged him entirely, or whether he was simply a clever man who understood precisely how to make an unwelcome bargain seem like mercy. By morning, she had made her decision, though it left an uneasy weight in her chest that she could not quite name. She would accept his offer, not because she trusted him, but because she saw no better path forward, and because some small, stubborn part of her, the same part that had chased rare paintings and hidden treasures through every dusty auction room in London, was curious to see what truths lay waiting inside a duke's neglected estate, and what truths, perhaps, lay waiting inside the Duke himself. She sent her answer by messenger that same afternoon, a short note accepting his terms, and requesting only that the arrangement be put in writing, so that neither party might later claim to have misunderstood the other. The reply came within the hour, brief and businesslike, informing her that a carriage would call for her 3 days hence to convey her to Hertfordshire, where she would begin her survey of the estate's collections. 3 days gave her little time to prepare, and less time still to explain her sudden absence to her father, who would surely ask questions she was not yet ready to answer. In the end, she told him only that she had accepted a position assisting a wealthy family with the cataloging of their art collection, a task suited perfectly to her interests, and though he looked at her with some surprise, he did not press her further, perhaps too weary himself to argue against anything that might ease their circumstances. On the morning the carriage arrived, gleaming black with the Rensworth crest upon its door, Eleanor stood upon the front step with a single trunk of belongings and a heart that beat far too quickly for a woman merely traveling to catalog paintings. She told herself it was only nerves at the unfamiliar journey, only apprehension at the work ahead. She did not allow herself to consider, not yet, that some small part of her nervousness might have nothing at all to do with paintings, and everything to do with the man who would be waiting for her at the end of the road. The journey to Hertfordshire took the better part of a day, and Eleanor spent much of it staring out the window at the passing countryside, the neat hedgerows giving way gradually to wilder fields and thick clusters of oak trees as they left London further behind. She had brought with her a small notebook, intending to begin her preparations for the survey ahead, listing the categories of items she expected to encounter and the questions she would need to ask of the estate's staff regarding provenance and history. But her thoughts kept drifting from her notes to the strange turn her life had taken in so short a span of days, from rival bidder to reluctant business partner, from a woman scraping together shillings in secret to one riding in a duke's private carriage toward an uncertain future. When at last the carriage turned through a set of tall stone gates and began the long approach up a gravel drive lined with ancient elms, Eleanor pressed her face nearly to the glass, unable to help herself. The house that emerged from behind the trees was larger than she had expected, a great sprawling structure of gray stone, with tall windows catching the afternoon light, its gardens somewhat overgrown, but possessing the unmistakable bones of former grandeur. It looked, she thought, rather like a woman who had once been beautiful and had simply grown tired of maintaining the effort, though the beauty remained beneath the neglect for anyone patient enough to look. The carriage drew to a halt before the great front steps, and before the footman could even lower the step for her, the front door opened, and the Duke himself emerged, his expression carefully neutral, though Eleanor thought she detected something almost like relief in the set of his shoulders, as though he had genuinely doubted whether she would come at all. "Miss Ashworth," he said, offering his hand to help her down. "Welcome to Rensworth Park." She took his hand, feeling the warmth of his fingers through her glove, and looked up at the house looming above them, its many windows like watching eyes, its gardens whispering secrets in the autumn wind. Whatever waited for her within those walls, she understood now that there would be no simple retreat back to her old life, no return to the comfortable distance of rival bidders across an auction room floor. She had stepped, quite deliberately, into the Duke of Rensworth's world, and she intended to see precisely what truths it held, both among the paintings and porcelain that awaited her discerning eye, and within the guarded heart of the man who had brought her here. "Thank you for the welcome, Your Grace," she said, and together they climbed the steps toward the great front doors, where a new chapter of her strange and uncertain arrangement was about to begin. The inside of Rensworth Park matched the outside in its strange contradiction of grandeur and neglect. Eleanor followed the Duke through a wide entrance hall, lined with portraits, so darkened by decades of soot and candle smoke that she could barely make out the faces staring down from their heavy gilt frames. A curved staircase rose toward the upper floors, its banister carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines, though a fine layer of dust softened every edge. She noticed at once the particular quality of silence that settles over a house left too long without proper attention, not quite abandoned, but certainly forgotten by whoever ought to have cared for it. "My uncle rarely left London in his later years," the Duke explained, as though sensing her thoughts. "He kept only a small staff here, enough to prevent the roof from falling in and little more. When he died, I inherited not only the house but everything within it, and I confess, I have had neither the time nor the expertise to determine what deserves saving." Eleanor turned slowly, taking in the scale of the task before her, and felt something within her settle into familiar territory, despite the strangeness of her surroundings. Whatever uncertainty she still harbored about the Duke himself, this she understood completely. The particular thrill of standing amid unexamined treasures, not knowing yet what might be discovered beneath the dust. "Where would you like me to begin, Your Grace?" "Wherever you think best," he said. "I will not pretend to guide you in matters where you clearly possess greater knowledge than I do. Consider the house entirely at your disposal, though I would ask that you take your meals with me in the evenings, if only so I might learn something of what you discover each day." She agreed, though the prospect of sharing meals with him each evening sent an unexpected flutter through her chest that she chose firmly to ignore. A housekeeper named Mrs. Findlay was summoned to show Eleanor to her room, a modest but comfortable chamber on the second floor, overlooking the gardens. And once she had settled her few belongings and changed from her traveling clothes, she wasted no time in beginning her survey of the house. She started in the long gallery on the ground floor, where dozens of paintings hung in uneven rows, some clearly the work of skilled hands, others amateur efforts that had likely been painted by family members over the generations and preserved out of sentiment rather than merit. She moved slowly along the wall, examining brushwork, checking the backs of canvases for maker's marks, and making careful notes in the small book she had brought with her. It was tedious, painstaking work, but Eleanor found in it a familiar comfort, the same quiet satisfaction she had always felt when puzzling out the truth hidden within an object others had overlooked. By late afternoon, she had identified 3 paintings of genuine value among the gallery's collection, including a portrait she suspected had been painted by a respected society artist some 60 years prior. Its subject unknown, but its craftsmanship unmistakable. She had also found, tucked behind a stack of old frames in a disused storeroom, a small collection of leather-bound books that appeared to be a complete set of early scientific treatises, the sort that collectors of natural philosophy would pay a considerable sum to acquire. When evening came, she joined the Duke in a modestly sized dining room, far smaller and more intimate than she had expected, for a house of such grandeur, and found him already seated at the table, with a decanter of wine, and an expression of genuine curiosity that she had not often seen on him during their many encounters at auction. "Well, Miss Ashworth," he said, as a servant brought in the first course, "what have you discovered?" She told him of the portrait, the scientific treatises, and several smaller items of interest, watching, as his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something closer to genuine surprise. He asked thoughtful questions about how she determined authenticity, listening carefully to her explanations of brushwork and provenance. and she found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, enjoying the conversation far more than she had anticipated. "You make it sound almost like solving a mystery," he said at one point. "It is very like solving a mystery," she agreed. "Every object carries evidence of its own history, if one knows how to read it. A painting tells you who painted it, through the way the artist mixed their colors, the direction of their brushstrokes, even the type of canvas they preferred. A book tells you its age through the binding, the type of paper, the manner of printing. One simply must learn to listen to what the object itself is trying to say. And what does this house say to you, so far?" She considered the question seriously before answering. "It says that someone once loved beautiful things, but grew tired, or perhaps grew sad, and simply stopped tending to what they had gathered. There is real value here, Your Grace, hidden beneath years of neglect, but it will take patience to uncover all of it." Something flickered across his face at her words, a shadow of some private thought she could not quite interpret, and for a moment, she wondered if she had touched upon something more personal than she intended. But he said nothing of it, only refilled her glass, and asked her to continue describing what else she had found that day, and the conversation moved on to safer ground. Over the following days, a routine began to establish itself between them. Eleanor spent her mornings and afternoons moving through the house, room by room, cataloging its contents with the same rigor she had once applied to her secret work at London's auction houses, though now she did so openly, without fear of discovery, or the need to hide her earnings from her father's notice. In the evenings, she and the Duke dined together, and their conversations grew steadily easier, the sharp edges of their old rivalry softening into something that felt, if not quite friendship, then at least a comfortable understanding. She learned, in scattered pieces over those evening meals, something of the man behind the ducal title. He had inherited his position young, following the sudden death of his father, and had spent the years since learning to manage estates, tenants, and investments, with a seriousness that left little room for the frivolous pursuits many young men of his rank indulged in freely. He mentioned, once, an old friend from his university days who had gone on to become a respected scholar, and she noticed the wistfulness in his voice when he spoke of a life he might have led had circumstances been different, one with more books and fewer ledgers. For her part, Eleanor found herself sharing more than she had intended as well, telling him of her mother's death when she was still a young girl, of the quiet years that followed when her father had thrown himself into managing their small estate, with a diligence that had, until recently, kept them comfortably provided for. She spoke of her love of paintings and old books not as mere commodities to be bought and sold, but as windows into other lives, other times, other minds long since departed from the world but still speaking, in their own quiet way, through the objects they had left behind. It was on the 5th evening of her stay, as they sat together over a simple supper of roasted fowl and buttered vegetables, that the Duke set down his fork and regarded her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost hesitant, almost uncertain. "May I ask you something, Miss Ashworth?" "Of course." "Why did you never marry? You must have had offers. A woman of your intelligence and spirit does not go unnoticed in London society, whatever her family's financial troubles." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the question, though she answered honestly, as she had found herself doing more and more often in his company. "I had offers, yes, though fewer than you might imagine, and none from men who seemed to want anything more than a pleasant wife to manage their households while they pursued their own interests elsewhere. I suppose I decided, somewhere along the way, that I would rather remain unmarried and useful to my father than married and invisible to my husband. And has that decision brought you happiness?" She considered the question more carefully than she expected to. "It has brought me purpose," she said finally. "Whether that is the same as happiness, I confess I have not yet decided." The Duke studied her for a long moment across the candle-lit table, and something in his gaze made her breath catch slightly in her throat, though she could not have said exactly why. Then he smiled, a real smile, the first she had seen from him that was not tinged with irony or reserve, and the conversation turned to lighter matters, though Eleanor found herself thinking of his question long after she had retired to her chamber that night, wondering when precisely she had begun to care so much what a duke thought of her answers. The following morning brought a discovery that would prove far more significant than any painting or book she had yet uncovered. While searching through a locked cabinet in what had once been the old duke's private study, Eleanor found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, tucked behind a false panel that she had only discovered by accident, while checking the cabinet's dimensions against the space it occupied on the wall. She hesitated before opening them, uncertain whether such private correspondence was truly meant for her eyes, but curiosity, as it so often did, won out over caution, and she carefully untied the ribbon and began to read. What she found within those letters would change everything she thought she understood about the Duke of Rensworth, and about the guarded heart he kept so carefully hidden behind his composed and dutiful exterior. The letters were not addressed to the Duke himself, but to his late uncle, from a woman named Margaret whose surname had been carefully cut away from every page, as though someone had once feared these letters falling into the wrong hands, and had taken pains to protect her identity, even in private correspondence. Eleanor read through several of them before she began to understand their significance, and when she did, she set them down upon the desk with a strange, uncomfortable feeling settling in her chest. The letters spoke of a young woman named Margaret who had once been engaged to marry the current Duke, years before he had inherited his title, back when he had been merely the second son of a wealthy family, with no expectation of ever holding the dukedom himself. According to the letters, written by the uncle to a friend and evidently never sent, Margaret had broken the engagement suddenly, and without clear explanation, shortly after learning that the Duke's elder brother had died unexpectedly, leaving the title and its considerable fortune to fall unexpectedly upon her intended husband instead. The uncle's letters, written with evident anger on behalf of his nephew, suggested that Margaret's family had encouraged the match only for the modest fortune the second son had once possessed, and that upon learning he would soon inherit a dukedom, they had suddenly pushed for a swifter marriage than propriety allowed, hoping to secure the connection before any other family could intervene with a more advantageous offer for their daughter. The young Duke, according to his uncle's account, had grown suspicious of this sudden urgency and had confronted Margaret directly, only to learn that she herself had already accepted a private understanding with another suitor, one of higher rank than the Duke had been before his brother's death, and had simply been waiting to see which prospect would prove more advantageous before revealing her true intentions. Eleanor sat very still for a long moment after finishing the last letter, understanding now, with sudden and painful clarity, why the Duke of Rensworth kept himself so carefully guarded, why he approached even simple conversations about marriage and happiness with such visible caution, why he had built around himself the same sort of quiet, composed distance that Eleanor herself had adopted, after years of watching suitors court her more for her father's remaining property than for any genuine affection. She did not know what to do with this knowledge. It was not hers to have discovered, and she felt a genuine pang of guilt at having read letters never meant for her eyes. Even if they had been left carelessly hidden in a cabinet she had every right to search as part of her work. She retied the ribbon carefully and set the bundle aside, intending to give them to the Duke privately, rather than simply cataloging them among the estate's other papers, and resolved to say nothing of what she had learned, unless he chose to raise the matter himself. That evening at supper, she found herself watching him with new eyes, noticing details she had perhaps seen before, without truly understanding their meaning. The careful way he phrased his questions about her own feelings on marriage, never pressing too hard, always leaving room for her to retreat if she wished. The slight tension in his shoulders whenever conversation turned toward matters of the heart, quickly smoothed over with a joke or a change of subject. The genuine surprise, almost disbelief, that had crossed his face when she had told him of her own reasons for remaining unmarried, as though the idea that a woman might choose independence over a hollow match was entirely foreign to his experience. "I found something today that I believe belongs to you," she said finally, once the meal had concluded and the servants had withdrawn from the room. She produced the bundle of letters from her reticule and set them upon the table between them, watching his face carefully as recognition dawned. His expression changed the moment he saw the faded ribbon. A flicker of surprise followed swiftly by something more guarded, more painful, as though old wounds she had not intended to reopen had suddenly been laid bare before them both. "Where did you find these?" "Behind a false panel in the old study," she said gently. "I did not read them with any intention of prying into matters that are not my concern, Your Grace. But I confess, I could not set them aside, once I understood what they contained. I am sorry if I have caused you any distress by finding them." He did not answer at once. Instead, he picked up the bundle and turned it over slowly in his hands, as though weighing whether to open it again or cast it directly into the fire. When he finally spoke, His voice carried a weariness she had not heard from him before, the careful composure slipping just enough to reveal the genuine hurt beneath it. My uncle always believed he was protecting my interests, writing such things, though he never showed them to me while he lived. I suppose some part of him hoped I might find them one day, and understand that what happened was not my fault, whatever I might have believed at the time. Eleanor waited quietly, sensing that he needed the space to continue without pressing him further, and after a long moment, he did. "I was 23 when it happened," he said, "younger than you are now, if I recall correctly, and entirely convinced that I understood something of love, having known Margaret since we were children together in the country. I believed, in my youthful arrogance, that our affection for one another was genuine and unshakable. When my brother died, and I inherited everything so suddenly, so unexpectedly, I thought at first that Margaret's family's eagerness to hasten our marriage was simply excitement at the good fortune that had befallen us both. It took me some months to understand the truth, that what I had believed was love had, on her side at least, always been calculation, waiting patiently to see which suitor would prove the more profitable investment. "I am sorry," Eleanor said quietly, and she meant it with a sincerity that surprised her with its intensity. "It was a long time ago," he said, though his tone suggested the wound had not fully healed, despite the years that had passed. "I tell myself I have made my peace with it. I tell myself I have learned a valuable lesson about the true nature of the affections people offer a man of my position. But I confess, Miss Ashworth, that discovering these letters again, and discussing them with you now, has reminded me how carefully I have avoided trusting anyone with anything more than polite conversation and careful negotiation ever since." Eleanor reached across the table, an impulse she did not fully understand, until her hand was already resting lightly upon his, and she felt him go very still at the touch, as though uncertain how to respond to such simple, unguarded kindness after so many years of careful distance. "Not everyone calculates as she did," Eleanor said softly. "Some of us simply want to understand the truth of things, whether in a painting, a book, or a person. It seems to me that a man who has spent years managing an entire estate with such evident care, who offers arrangements to strangers that protect their families rather than exploit their misfortune, has learned rather better lessons from his past than he gives himself credit for." He looked at her then with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something raw and searching, as though he were trying to determine whether her words were merely kind or whether they carried some deeper truth he had long since given up hoping to find in another person. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the candlelight flickering between them, the old letters lying forgotten upon the table, and Eleanor felt, with sudden and unmistakable clarity, that something had shifted between them in that quiet room, something that neither auction-room rivalry nor business arrangement had ever quite prepared her for. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Ashworth," he said finally, his voice low and unusually earnest. "I find myself increasingly grateful for whatever strange turn of circumstance brought your father's debt into my possession, though I would never have wished such trouble upon you or your family, merely for the pleasure of your company." Eleanor withdrew her hand slowly, suddenly aware of how close they had drawn together over the small table, and forced a small, uncertain laugh to ease the sudden intensity that had settled over the room. "Then perhaps, Your Grace, we ought to consider it a fortunate misfortune," she said, "though I confess, I still intend to outbid you at every auction we attend together in the future, whatever arrangement now exists between us." He laughed then, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed to lighten something in his chest, and the tension of the moment eased, though not entirely, into something warmer and more comfortable than either of them had quite expected when the evening began. They spoke for a while longer of lighter matters, before retiring for the night, but as Eleanor climbed the stairs to her chamber, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the vulnerability she had glimpsed in him, to the letters that had revealed a wound far deeper than she had imagined, and to the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had begun to grow within her own chest whenever she found herself in his company. She told herself, as she prepared for bed that night, that such feelings were foolish, that she had come to Wrensworth Park to save her father from ruin and nothing more, that whatever arrangement existed between herself and the Duke was purely one of business and practicality, however pleasant their evening conversations had become. But even as she told herself these things, she knew, with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to every painting and every ledger, that she was already beginning to care for Gareth Ashford, far more than any sensible arrangement ought to allow, and she wondered, with equal parts hope and apprehension, whether he might be beginning to feel the same. The days that followed brought a change in the rhythm of the household that neither Eleanor nor Gareth openly acknowledged, though both felt it plainly enough. Where once their evening meals had been occasions for careful, measured conversation, they now stretched long past the final course, filled with easy laughter, and the sort of unguarded talk that comes only between people who have begun to trust one another. Eleanor found herself looking forward to those suppers, with an eagerness she tried, not entirely successfully, to hide from herself. One morning, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, Gareth suggested that Eleanor accompany him into the nearby village to examine an old bookshop whose elderly owner had recently written to inform him of several volumes that had once belonged to his family, sold off decades earlier, during a period of financial strain long before his own time. Eleanor agreed at once, glad of the chance to stretch her legs beyond the walls of the great house, and the two of them set off together in a modest carriage, without the formality of a full retinue of servants, which Eleanor found she preferred a great deal. The village of Aldermarsh proved a pleasant, unassuming place, its main street lined with a handful of shops, a small church with a weathered stone spire, and a green where children played beneath the watchful eyes of their mothers. The bookshop, when they found it, was a narrow, crowded space, smelling pleasantly of old paper and leather bindings, presided over by a stooped, cheerful man named Mr. Whitfield, who greeted the Duke with evident familiarity, and Eleanor with open curiosity. Eleanor moved through the shelves with practiced efficiency, examining spines and title pages, occasionally pulling a volume free to check its condition or verify its edition against her memory of similar works she had encountered before. Gareth followed a step behind her, watching with an expression of quiet fascination that she caught more than once when she glanced up from her work. "You look at me the way I imagine you looked at that harbor painting," he said at one point, when she had paused over a slim volume of poetry bound in faded green leather. "And how is that, Your Grace?" "As though you are trying to determine whether I am genuine or merely a clever forgery," he said, and though his tone was light, there was something underneath it that suggested he was only half joking. Eleanor set the book down and regarded him thoughtfully. "I have had a great deal of practice determining authenticity," she said. "I find, more often than not, that the things people fear are false turn out to be quite genuine after all, if one simply takes the time to look closely enough." He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and something passed between them in that narrow, book-lined aisle that neither of them spoke aloud, though both understood it plainly enough. It was Mr. Whitfield's cheerful interruption, calling out that he had found the particular volume the Duke had inquired after, that finally broke the spell, and they returned to their business with slightly heightened color in both their cheeks. They spent the better part of the afternoon in that manner, moving from the bookshop to a small tea room where they took a simple luncheon, and then to the green itself, where they walked slowly among the autumn leaves scattered across the grass, discussing everything from the history of the volumes they had purchased to Eleanor's growing plans for cataloging the remainder of the estate's collections. She found herself telling him things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Charlotte Vane, her dearest friend, about her fears for her father's health, her private hopes of one day opening a small establishment of her own, where she might trade honestly in art and antiquities, without needing to hide her work from polite society. "That is a fine ambition," he said, when she had finished describing her modest dream. "Why do you speak of it as though it were something to be embarrassed by?" "Because a woman who trades in goods for profit is not generally considered a proper lady," she said, with a wry twist to her mouth. "My father would be horrified if he knew the full extent of what I have done these past 2 years, however much it has helped to keep us afloat." "Then perhaps your father ought to reconsider what proper truly means," Gareth said, and something in the firmness of his tone made Eleanor look at him with surprise. "I have met a great many proper ladies in my life, Miss Ashworth, most of whom possess neither your intelligence nor your industry, and I confess I find the distinction between what is proper and what is admirable growing thinner with every day I spend in your company." Eleanor did not know how to answer that, and for a moment they simply walked in silence, the fallen leaves crunching softly beneath their boots, the distant sound of children's laughter drifting across the green. She felt, with a mixture of pleasure and apprehension she could not quite untangle, that whatever had begun between them in that quiet dining room over the old letters was continuing to grow, quietly and steadily, with each new conversation, each shared silence, each unguarded moment they spent together, away from the watchful eyes of London society. Upon their return to Rensworth Park that evening, they found a letter waiting for Gareth, delivered by a rider who had evidently been sent with some urgency, and Eleanor watched his expression shift as he read its contents, from mild curiosity to something closer to reluctant resignation. "My cousin, Lady Featherstone, is hosting a house party at her estate in Surrey next week," he explained, folding the letter and setting it aside. "She has invited a great many guests, as she does each autumn, and has apparently heard of my recent interest in restoring Rensworth Park's collections. She wishes me to bring along whatever expert I have engaged for the task, having apparently learned of your involvement through channels I cannot begin to guess at." Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at the idea of appearing before London society as the Duke's hired expert, uncertain how such an arrangement would be perceived by people far less generous in their judgments than Gareth himself had proven to be. But she also felt, beneath that unease, a curl of genuine excitement at the prospect of a house party, a world she had rarely been invited into during the years of her family's decline, and she found herself agreeing to attend before she had fully considered the implications. "It will mean facing a great deal of curiosity," Gareth warned her gently. "My cousin's guests are not always kind in their speculation, and our arrangement, however innocent, may invite more gossip than either of us would prefer." "I have weathered gossip before," Eleanor said, with more confidence than she entirely felt. "I imagine I can weather a little more." He smiled at that, though something in his eyes suggested he was not entirely convinced, and he promised to ensure she was treated with every courtesy during their stay at Lady Featherstone's estate. Eleanor spent the following days dividing her attention between finishing her survey of the most valuable rooms in Rensworth Park and preparing herself, both practically and emotionally, for the scrutiny that awaited her among the fashionable guests soon to gather in Surrey. She wrote to Charlotte Vane, her closest friend since childhood, describing the strange turn her circumstances had taken, though she was careful to omit the deeper feelings that had begun to take root within her, unwilling to give voice to something she herself did not yet fully understand. Charlotte's reply arrived within days, filled with equal parts excitement and gentle teasing, urging Eleanor to guard her heart carefully around a man who held such power over her family's fortune, however kind he had proven himself thus far. "Guard your heart, Eleanor," Charlotte had written, "for a duke's kindness can turn quickly to indifference once his curiosity has been satisfied, and I would not see you wounded by hopes that a man of his rank may never intend to fulfill." Eleanor read those words several times before folding the letter away, telling herself that Charlotte's caution was wise, that she ought to remember precisely why she had come to Rensworth Park in the first place, and that whatever warmth had grown between herself and Gareth these past weeks was likely nothing more than the natural closeness that develops between people thrown together by circumstance, destined to fade once her work at the estate was complete and her father's debt settled. But even as she told herself these sensible, cautious things, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the way Gareth had looked at her in that narrow bookshop aisle, to the raw honesty in his voice when he had spoken of Margaret's betrayal, to the quiet warmth of his hand beneath her own that evening at supper, and she began to suspect, with a mixture of hope and fear she could not entirely suppress, that guarding her heart against the Duke of Rensworth might already have become an impossible task. Lady Featherstone's estate in Surrey proved every bit as grand as Eleanor had feared, a sprawling collection of manicured lawns and towering stone facades that made Rensworth Park's neglected grandeur seem almost humble by comparison. Carriages lined the long drive as Eleanor and Gareth arrived on the appointed afternoon, and she felt the weight of dozens of curious glances settle upon her the moment she stepped down from the carriage, dressed in her best gown, which she suspected still looked rather plain beside the silks and satins worn by the other assembled guests. Lady Featherstone herself greeted them at the door, a tall, sharp-eyed woman whose warm smile did not entirely disguise the calculating curiosity in her gaze as she looked Eleanor over from bonnet to boots. "Miss Ashworth," she said, extending a gloved hand, "my cousin tells me you possess quite a remarkable eye for art and antiquities. I confess I am eager to hear more of your work at Rensworth Park." Eleanor curtsied properly and offered a few modest remarks about her findings thus far, careful to keep her tone professional and her manner composed, though she could feel the weight of a dozen other guests listening from a discreet distance. their expressions ranging from polite interest to open speculation. She understood, without needing to be told directly, that her presence at this gathering, as the Duke's hired expert, had already become a matter of considerable gossip among Lady Featherstone's circle, and she resolved to conduct herself with such evident professionalism that no one could reasonably question the propriety of the arrangement. The evening's entertainment, it transpired, was to be an elaborate game devised by Lady Featherstone for the amusement of her guests, a sort of treasure hunt through the extensive grounds and house, in which pairs of participants would search for a series of hidden objects and clues, the winning pair to be awarded a small but valuable prize donated by their hostess. Names were drawn from a bowl to determine partnerships, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist with a mixture of hope and apprehension as Lady Featherstone read out the pairings one by one, until finally her own name was called alongside that of the Duke of Rensworth. A ripple of whispered comment passed through the assembled guests at the announcement, and Eleanor caught sight of several raised eyebrows and knowing glances exchanged among the ladies present, though Gareth appeared entirely unbothered, offering her his arm with a small, reassuring smile as they set off together to begin the search for their first clue. The game carried them through the gardens as dusk settled over the estate. Lanterns hung along the pathways, casting a warm golden light over hedgerows and flower beds, already touched by the first frost of the season. They solved their clues together, with a growing ease that mirrored the comfort they had developed over their weeks at Rensworth Park, laughing over a particularly obscure riddle hidden within an ornamental sundial, working in easy tandem to search a small folly at the edge of the lake for the object concealed within. It was in the estate's library, their final destination according to the evening's clues, that the game's playful atmosphere shifted into something else entirely. The room was empty when they arrived, most of the other guests having already searched it earlier in the evening and moved on to other locations, and the only light came from a single branch of candles left burning upon a reading table, casting long shadows across the towering shelves that lined every wall. Eleanor moved along one wall, searching for the final hidden clue among the spines of ancient volumes, while Gareth searched the opposite side of the room, and for a while, neither of them spoke, the comfortable silence of shared purpose settling between them, as it so often had during her work at Rensworth Park. Then Eleanor, reaching for a book that seemed to sit slightly askew upon its shelf, found her fingers brushing against a small folded paper tucked behind it, and she drew it out with a small exclamation of triumph. "I believe I have found it," she said, turning to show him, only to discover that he had crossed the room silently and now stood far closer to her than she had realized, close enough that she could see the flicker of candlelight reflected in his dark eyes, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and clean linen that seemed to follow him always. "Well done," he said softly, though he made no move to take the paper from her hand, his gaze fixed instead upon her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Eleanor felt suddenly and acutely aware of everything, the warmth radiating from him despite the small distance still separating them, the quiet crackle of the candles, the soft rustle of her own gown as she shifted her weight, uncertain what to do with the sudden tension that had settled over the room like a held breath. "Gareth," she said, his given name slipping from her lips before she could stop it, and something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, softening further, though his gaze did not waver from hers. "Eleanor," he answered, his voice low and rough in a way she had never heard from him before, and slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to step away should she wish it, he lifted one hand to gently brush a stray curl from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin with a tenderness that made her heart race wildly beneath her bodice. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the space between them charged with something neither had spoken aloud, but both had surely felt growing since that first quiet evening over the old letters, since the bookshop in Aldermarsh, since perhaps the very first auction, where their gazes had locked across a crowded room, and neither had been able to look away. Eleanor felt herself leaning imperceptibly closer, drawn by a pull she no longer had any wish to resist, and she saw the same longing mirrored plainly in Gareth's eyes as he lowered his head slowly toward hers. The sound of approaching voices and laughter from the corridor outside broke the spell before their lips could meet, and both of them stepped back quickly, Eleanor's cheeks flaming with color as she busied herself smoothing her skirts, Gareth clearing his throat and turning toward the door just as two other guests entered the library in search of their own hidden clue. laughing merrily, and entirely unaware of what they had interrupted. "We should return the paper to Lady Featherstone," Eleanor said, her voice not quite steady, and Gareth nodded, offering her his arm once more with a composure that did not entirely mask the heightened color in his own cheeks. They walked back through the gardens toward the main house, in a silence that felt entirely different from their earlier comfortable quiet, charged now with the memory of what had very nearly happened between them, and what both of them understood, without needing to speak it aloud, would surely happen again should circumstances allow. Eleanor found herself replaying the moment over and over as she prepared for bed that night, in the guest chamber Lady Featherstone had assigned her, the warmth of his fingers against her cheek, the low, rough sound of her own name upon his lips, and she understood, with a clarity that both thrilled and frightened her in equal measure, that whatever careful distance she had once maintained between herself and the Duke of Rensworth had entirely collapsed, leaving her standing at the edge of something far more significant than any business arrangement had ever promised to become. She did not know, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that even as she lay awake turning over the events of the evening, another guest at Lady Featherstone's gathering had watched the entire exchange in the library from the shadowed doorway, and had already begun, with quiet and deliberate malice, to consider how best to use what she had witnessed to her own advantage. The woman who had watched them from the shadowed doorway was Lady Featherstone's own niece, a young woman named Beatrice Longmore, who had spent the better part of the past year hoping to secure the Duke of Rensworth's attention for herself. Beatrice possessed a modest fortune and a considerable ambition, and she had watched with growing frustration over recent months, as the Duke's attentions seemed increasingly occupied elsewhere, first by rumors of his frequent appearances at obscure auction houses, and now, it seemed, by the very woman he had apparently engaged there. Beatrice said nothing that evening, retreating quietly to her own chamber, with her thoughts already turning toward how best to use what she had seen. She was not a cruel woman by nature, but she was a determined one, and she had convinced herself over the following days that whatever tenderness existed between the Duke and his hired art expert could only be the product of Eleanor's calculated ambition, a clever scheme to secure a wealthy husband through manufactured intimacy, rather than any genuine affection on either side. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the scrutiny that had settled upon her, spending the remaining days of the house party in a pleasant haze of stolen glances and quiet conversations with Gareth, though neither of them spoke directly of what had nearly happened in the library that first evening. There existed between them now an unspoken understanding, a warmth that colored every interaction, however carefully they maintained proper distance in the company of others. On the final evening of the gathering, following a formal dinner and several hours of dancing in Lady Featherstone's grand ballroom, Eleanor found herself briefly alone with Gareth upon a small balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, having stepped outside for a moment of quiet air, away from the noise and heat of the crowded room within. "I have been thinking," Gareth said, joining her at the balustrade, "about what nearly happened between us in the library." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at his words, though she kept her gaze fixed upon the gardens below, unable to quite meet his eyes as she answered. "As have I," she admitted quietly. "I do not regret it," he said, turning to face her fully now. "I have spent a great many years, Eleanor, guarding myself carefully against precisely this sort of feeling, convinced that anyone who claimed to care for me did so only for what I could offer them in return. But I find, in your company, that I no longer entirely believe that of you." She turned to look at him then, her heart racing at the earnestness in his voice, at the vulnerability so plainly written across his features, so different from the guarded composure he presented to the rest of the world. "I care for you, Gareth," she said softly, the words emerging before she had fully decided to speak them, though she found she meant them completely. "Not for your title, nor your fortune, nor even for what remains of my father's debt. I care for the man who spends his evenings discussing brushwork and provenance with genuine interest, who offered me an arrangement that protected my family rather than exploited it, who trusted me with the truth of his own past even knowing how painful it was to speak aloud." Gareth reached for her hand then, lacing his fingers through hers with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the moonlight, the sounds of the party drifting faintly from the ballroom behind them, neither quite ready to speak of what such feelings might mean for their future, but both entirely certain, for the first time, that whatever existed between them was genuine and worth protecting. "I would like," he said finally, "to court you properly, Eleanor, once we return to London. Not as an arrangement born of debt and obligation, but as a man who wishes to know a remarkable woman better, and who hopes, in time, she might come to care for him as more than simply the holder of her father's note." Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, though they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow, and she nodded, unable to trust her voice for a moment before she finally answered. "I would like that very much," she said. They returned to the ballroom shortly after, careful to maintain proper distance as they rejoined the other guests, though Eleanor felt as though she were walking on air for the remainder of the evening, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She did not notice Beatrice Longmore watching her from across the room with narrowed eyes, nor did she suspect, as she finally retired for the night, that the seeds of a scheme far more damaging than any auction house rivalry had already begun to take root. The following morning, as the guests began their departures back to London and their various country estates, Eleanor and Gareth traveled together back to Rensworth Park, their conversation during the journey filled with a new lightness, a comfortable ease, born of feelings, finally spoken aloud, rather than merely felt in silence. Eleanor spent her remaining days at the estate finishing her survey of its collections, cataloguing the final rooms with the same careful diligence she had brought to every previous task, though now accompanied more often than not by Gareth himself, who seemed to find increasing reasons to join her in whatever room she happened to be working, offering conversation and, more than once, a stolen kiss when they were certain no servants were near enough to observe. She completed her work at Rensworth Park within the fortnight, having identified enough valuable pieces among the estate's collections to more than cover the remaining balance of her father's debt several times over, a fact that brought her genuine relief, even as it complicated the nature of the arrangement that had first brought her there. Gareth insisted, gently but firmly, that whatever proceeds came from the sale of the estate's treasures would be applied entirely to erasing her father's obligation, regardless of what feelings had since grown between them, unwilling to let anyone ever suggest that his affections had been purchased through financial leverage rather than freely given. Upon her return to London, Eleanor found her father in noticeably improved spirits, having received word from the Duke's solicitor that his debt had been substantially reduced through the successful sale of several items from the Rensworth Park collections, with the promise of full satisfaction to follow shortly. She did not tell him the full truth of her feelings for the Duke, not yet, wishing to allow whatever grew between herself and Gareth the chance to develop naturally, away from the pressures and expectations that public knowledge would inevitably bring. But London society, as Eleanor would soon discover, rarely allowed such private matters to remain private for long, and within days of her return, whispers had already begun to circulate through the fashionable drawing rooms of Mayfair, whispers that Beatrice Longmore had taken considerable care to plant and nurture, painting Eleanor not as a woman who had found genuine affection through unlikely circumstance, but as a calculating opportunist who had deliberately engineered her father's debt, or at the very least, exploited it shamelessly, in order to trap a wealthy duke into an advantageous match. The first hint Eleanor received of the rumors circulating against her came from Charlotte Vane, who arrived at the Ashworth household one afternoon with an expression of such evident distress that Eleanor knew immediately something was gravely wrong before her friend had even removed her bonnet. "You must hear this from me before you hear it elsewhere," Charlotte said, settling into a chair with visible reluctance. "There is talk, Eleanor, ugly talk, being spread through half the drawing rooms in Mayfair, suggesting that you deliberately encouraged your father's gambling, or at the very least, knew of it long before you claim, in order to place him in debt to a wealthy man, whom you then set about seducing through your work at his estate." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Charlotte spoke, the accusation so far removed from the truth, yet so precisely calculated to poison whatever tender feelings had grown between herself and Gareth, that she could scarcely draw breath to respond. "That is monstrous," she finally managed. "Who would say such things?" "I do not know the source with certainty," Charlotte admitted, "though I suspect it began among Lady Featherstone's circle, given how specifically the rumors describe events at her house party. Someone has clearly taken pains to make the story as damaging as possible, Eleanor, and I fear it is spreading faster than either of us can hope to contain." Eleanor spent the following days in a state of mounting anxiety, watching as the careful respectability she had worked so hard to maintain despite her family's financial troubles began to crumble beneath the weight of gossip she had no way to properly refute. She received fewer invitations than she had grown accustomed to, noticed pointed silences and averted eyes when she encountered acquaintances upon the street, and felt, with growing dismay, the particular cruelty of a society eager to believe the worst of a woman who had dared to rise above her circumstances through her own talent and industry. Worse still, she noticed a subtle but unmistakable change in Gareth's manner when they next met, a formal dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances that neither of them could easily avoid without drawing further comment. He remained perfectly courteous throughout the evening, but the warmth that had characterized their recent interactions seemed to have retreated behind the same careful composure he had worn during their earliest encounters at auction, and Eleanor felt the distance between them like a physical ache. "You have heard the rumors," she said quietly, when they finally found a moment alone in a quiet corner of the drawing room following dinner. "I have heard them," he admitted, his expression guarded in a way that wounded her more deeply than she cared to admit. "I do not believe them, Eleanor. But I confess, they have given me pause, not because I doubt your character, but because I find myself wondering whether our arrangement, however innocently it began, has now become impossible to separate from suspicion in the eyes of the world." "What are you saying?" she asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. "I am saying," he said carefully, "that perhaps we ought to consider whether continuing our courtship at this time would only invite further scandal, for both our families. Perhaps some distance, until the talk has died down, would serve us both better than continuing forward as though nothing has changed." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest at his words, a fear she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge until that moment, that whatever affection Gareth held for her might prove, in the end, too fragile to withstand the weight of society's judgment, exactly as Charlotte had warned her it might. "I see," she said, her voice carefully controlled, despite the hurt churning within her. "Then perhaps you are right, Your Grace. Perhaps it would be wisest for us both to step back from whatever arrangement we believed existed between us, before matters grow any more complicated than they already have." She left the gathering shortly afterward, unable to bear the polite conversation surrounding her for another moment, and cried herself to sleep that night for the first time in years, mourning not only the loss of Gareth's warmth, but the bitter unfairness of a world that would punish her for daring to hope for something more than a life of quiet, careful obligation. The following days brought little relief. The rumors continued to circulate, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until Eleanor scarcely recognized herself in the calculating villain society had constructed, from her honest efforts to save her family from ruin. Her father, learning at last of the gossip surrounding his own gambling debts and his daughter's supposed scheming, fell into a state of shame and self-recrimination that pained Eleanor deeply, though she found she had little strength remaining to comfort him while nursing her own wounded heart. It was Charlotte, ever loyal and increasingly determined to uncover the truth behind the malicious rumors, who eventually discovered the source of the scheme, having pressed a mutual acquaintance who had attended Lady Featherstone's house party for details of exactly who had been present in the library that fateful evening. The acquaintance, after some hesitation, admitted that Beatrice Longmore had been seen leaving that same corridor shortly before the treasure hunt concluded, and had been noticeably cold toward Eleanor throughout the remainder of the gathering. Charlotte brought this information to Eleanor at once, along with a fierce determination that the truth must not be allowed to remain buried beneath Beatrice's malicious invention. "You cannot simply accept this injustice, Eleanor," Charlotte insisted. "You must find some way to prove your honesty, some way to show the world, and show the Duke himself, that whatever grew between you was genuine, and worth more than his fear of scandal." Eleanor knew Charlotte spoke sense, however painful the path forward might prove. She could not simply retreat into quiet humiliation, allowing a jealous woman's lies to destroy both her reputation and whatever chance remained for genuine happiness with Gareth. She began, that very evening, to consider how she might publicly demonstrate the sincerity of her feelings and the honesty of her conduct throughout the entire affair, in a manner so unmistakable that even the most determined gossips would find themselves unable to sustain their false narrative. An idea began to form, slowly in her mind, born from her years of experience navigating the world of auctions and public sales, a world where reputation and honesty were often tested most severely, in full view of one's rivals and peers. If she wished to prove the truth of her character, she realized, she would need to do so in the very arena where her rivalry with Gareth had first begun, before the eyes of the same society that now condemned her, in a gesture so bold and so clearly free of calculation that no reasonable person could continue to doubt her sincerity. Eleanor learned, through her network of contacts among London's dealers and auctioneers, that a significant sale was scheduled to take place within the fortnight, at the very auction house where she and Gareth had first crossed paths so many months earlier, a gathering certain to draw much of fashionable society, including, she suspected, several of the very individuals who had done the most to spread Beatrice Longmore's malicious gossip. She resolved that this sale would provide the perfect opportunity to demonstrate, beyond any reasonable doubt, the honesty of her character and the genuine nature of her feelings. Her plan was simple in concept, though it required a courage she was not entirely certain she possessed. Among her most treasured possessions was a small painting that had belonged to her late mother, a modest but genuine work, depicting a quiet garden scene, the one object Eleanor had steadfastly refused to sell, throughout even the most difficult months of her family's financial troubles, keeping it always as a private reminder of the mother she had lost too young. She decided that she would offer this painting for public sale, donating whatever proceeds it earned to a charitable fund for the relief of debtors' families, a gesture calculated to demonstrate plainly that her concern had never been for wealth or advantage, but for genuine principle. She wrote to the auction house requesting that the painting be included in the coming sale, and she made certain, through careful and discreet inquiries, that word of her intention reached the appropriate circles well before the day itself, ensuring that a substantial audience would be present to witness whatever unfolded. She did not inform Gareth of her plans, uncertain whether he would attend the sale at all, given the careful distance he had maintained since their conversation at the dinner party, and unwilling to risk his intervention or objection before she had the chance to prove herself entirely on her own merits. She dressed on the morning of the sale with particular care, choosing a gown of deep blue that had once belonged to her mother, altered to fit her own frame, feeling as though she carried some small measure of her mother's quiet strength with her as she set out for the auction house. The room was crowded when she arrived, filled with the familiar faces of dealers and collectors she had come to know well over her years of attendance, alongside a noticeably larger contingent of fashionable society than such sales typically attracted. Drawn, she suspected, by curiosity over the scandal that had attached itself to her name, she caught sight of Beatrice Longmore seated near the front of the room, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes sharp with unmistakable interest as Eleanor took her seat. She did not see Gareth among the crowd, and felt a small pang of disappointment, despite her resolve to proceed regardless of his presence. The sale progressed through its early lots, with the usual rhythm of bids and counterbids, and Eleanor waited with mounting nervousness for her mother's painting to be called forward, rehearsing silently in her mind the words she intended to speak once the moment arrived. When at last the auctioneer announced the small garden painting, describing its modest provenance and inviting opening bids, Eleanor rose from her seat before any bidding could properly begin, drawing startled glances from every corner of the room as she made her way to stand beside the auctioneer's podium. "Forgive the interruption," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed room, "but before this piece is sold, I wish to say a few words regarding its history, and regarding certain matters that have lately been the subject of considerable speculation among those gathered here today." She saw Beatrice's composed expression falter slightly at her words, and drew strength from the small victory as she continued, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt within. "This painting belonged to my late mother," she said, "and I have kept it through every difficulty my family has faced these past years, refusing to sell it even when our circumstances grew most dire. I offer it today not because I require the funds it might bring, but because I wish its proceeds to benefit a cause I believe worthy, the relief of families burdened by debts not entirely of their own making, families such as my own, whose difficulties have lately become the subject of unkind and entirely false rumor throughout this city." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd at her words, and Eleanor pressed forward before her courage could fail her. "I have heard the whispers suggesting I engineered my father's misfortune for my own advantage," she continued, "or that I calculated my way into an association with a man of considerable rank through deliberate scheming rather than honest work and genuine regard. I will not dignify such claims with lengthy defense, for I believe the truth speaks plainly enough for those willing to listen. I came to know the Duke of Rensworth through honest labor, cataloging treasures he himself could not properly assess, and if some genuine affection has grown between us in the course of that labor, I count it a blessing I neither sought nor calculated, but one I will not be ashamed to acknowledge before this room or any other." She had scarcely finished speaking when a voice rang out from the back of the crowded room, a voice she recognized instantly, and that sent her heart racing with sudden, overwhelming hope. "Nor should you be ashamed," Gareth said, moving forward through the parting crowd, until he stood beside her at the front of the room, his expression fierce, with an emotion she had rarely seen him display so openly before witnesses. "I have been a coward these past weeks, Miss Ashworth, allowing fear of scandal to overshadow what I know to be true in my own heart. I should have defended you the moment such vicious rumors reached my ears, rather than retreating into caution and leaving you to face this cruelty alone." The room had fallen entirely silent now, every eye fixed upon the two of them, as Gareth took Eleanor's hand before the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly enough that none present could later claim to have misunderstood his meaning. "I know the truth of Miss Ashworth's character better than anyone in this room," he continued. "I have watched her identify genuine treasures hidden among neglected collections others had long since dismissed as worthless. I have watched her labor tirelessly to protect her father from ruin, without ever once seeking advantage for herself. And I have come to care for her, deeply and genuinely, not for any calculation on her part, but for the honesty and courage she has shown at every turn, including this very moment, standing before you all to defend her own good name, when a lesser woman might simply have fled from such cruelty." Eleanor felt tears rising unbidden as he spoke, her heart overflowing with relief and love in equal measure, and when he turned to face her fully, lifting her hand gently to his lips before the astonished gaze of the entire assembly, she understood that whatever damage Beatrice Longmore's malicious scheme had intended to inflict, had, in this single unguarded moment, been entirely and permanently undone. The garden painting sold that day for a sum far greater than its modest value would ordinarily have commanded, as several collectors present, moved by the scene they had just witnessed, competed eagerly for the honor of owning a piece with such a story attached to it, and Eleanor watched with quiet astonishment as the final bid climbed to a figure that would provide substantial support to the very charitable cause she had named. Beatrice Longmore, she noticed, slipped quietly from the room before the sale concluded, her scheme thoroughly unraveled before the very society she had hoped to turn against Eleanor, and though Eleanor felt no particular satisfaction in her rival's humiliation, she could not deny a measure of relief that the truth had finally prevailed. In the weeks that followed, whatever remained of the malicious gossip surrounding Eleanor's character withered quickly under the weight of what so many witnesses had seen and heard that day at the auction house. Society, ever fickle in its judgments, proved just as eager to celebrate the romance between the Duke of Rensworth and the remarkable young woman who had won his heart through honesty and talent as it had once been to condemn her on the flimsiest of suspicions. Invitations that had grown scarce during the height of the scandal now arrived with renewed frequency, and Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own bemusement, regarded as something of a heroine among the very circles that had so recently doubted her. Gareth called upon her formally the following week, arriving at the Ashworth household with a bouquet of flowers and an expression of such earnest determination that Eleanor knew immediately something significant was about to unfold. He requested a private audience with her father first, and Eleanor waited with mounting anxiety in the drawing room, while the two men spoke behind closed doors, uncertain what precisely Gareth intended to say, though she suspected, with a flutter of hope she could scarcely contain, that she already knew. When at last Gareth emerged from her father's study, his expression had transformed into something warmer and more open than she had ever seen him wear in public, and he crossed the room directly to where she stood, taking both her hands in his with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I have just informed your father," he said, "that I intend to erase whatever remains of his debt entirely, not as part of any arrangement or bargain, but as a gift, freely given, with no expectation of return beyond his blessing, for what I hope to ask of you now." Eleanor felt her heart racing as he continued, sinking slowly to one knee before her, with a boldness that would have scandalized half of London had they been anywhere but the privacy of her own drawing room. "Eleanor Ashworth," he said, "I have spent months now believing myself incapable of trusting anyone with my heart. convinced by old wounds that genuine affection was a rarity I would never be fortunate enough to find. You have proven me entirely wrong, not through grand gestures alone, but through every quiet moment of honesty and courage you have shown me since the very first day we crossed paths at that auction house, competing over a painting neither of us truly needed, but both of us somehow recognized as valuable. I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man in England if you would consent to become my wife. Eleanor felt tears streaming freely down her cheeks now, tears of pure joy that she made no effort to hide, and she drew him gently to his feet before answering, unwilling to let him remain kneeling a moment longer than necessary. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Gareth, I will marry you, though I must warn you that I fully intend to continue outbidding you at every auction we attend for the remainder of our lives together. He laughed then, a rich, unguarded sound of pure happiness, and drew her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently of his feelings than any words could have managed. And Eleanor, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart, understood that she had found something far more valuable than any painting or rare book she had ever discovered in her years of careful searching, a love built not upon calculation or convenience, but upon genuine respect, shared purpose, and the simple, unshakable honesty that had defined their strange and unlikely courtship from its very first contentious moment. Their wedding took place some months later, at a small country church near Rensworth Park, attended by both families and a modest gathering of close friends, including Charlotte Vane, who wept openly throughout the ceremony and declared afterward that she had never doubted for a moment that Eleanor's happiness would prevail over any obstacle placed in its path. Eleanor's father, restored fully to his previous comfort and dignity through Gareth's generous erasure of his debt, walked his daughter down the aisle with tears of pride and relief shining in his eyes, having found, in his daughter's remarkable marriage, a measure of peace he had feared he might never know again. Some months into their marriage, Eleanor and Gareth found themselves once more at the very auction house where their story had begun, attending a sale of considerable interest to collectors throughout London. As a particularly fine painting was brought forward for bidding, Eleanor felt the old familiar thrill rise within her, and she glanced sideways at her husband with a challenging smile that he returned in full measure. "Shall we compete for it as we once did?" she asked quietly. "Or shall we bid together this time?" Gareth considered the question with mock seriousness before answering, his eyes warm with affection and unmistakable amusement. "I believe, my love," he said, "that we have already discovered the far greater treasure in one another, but I see no reason we cannot enjoy a friendly contest over a painting as well." They raised their paddles together when the bidding began, sometimes competing playfully against one another as they had in the earliest days of their acquaintance, sometimes joining forces to secure a piece they both admired, and as the afternoon wore on, amid the familiar rhythm of the auctioneer's voice and the friendly rivalry of collectors gathered from across the city, Eleanor reflected with quiet gratitude upon the strange and winding path that had carried her from a woman desperately scraping together shillings to save her family, to a duchess standing proudly beside a husband who valued her not, despite her independence and talent, but entirely because of it. Their story, whispered among London society for years afterward as one of the most remarkable romances of the age, remained always, at its heart, a simple truth that Eleanor herself had come to understand fully only through the trials of that eventful season, that genuine worth, whether found in a painting, a person, or a love built through honesty rather than calculation, only reveals itself fully to those patient and courageous enough to look beyond the surface, and brave enough to bid everything they possess on what they discover there.